Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined today by a very special guest, my fiancé, the head of our merch here at Last Stand Media, our coordinator, Mama Micah. Micah, do we say your last name? I actually don't even know. Do we say your last name? I was going to say it, but I don't even know if we do.
Oh, yeah, no, it's in all my emails and everything. Yeah, we say it.
Okay, Micah Watson. Micah Watson, show, my friend. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you today?
I'm good, my dear. You're in the room next to me, and we're recording. Yes. It's very awkward. But we haven't done a podcast together in a while. You were mentioning this to me. I don't know if you were doing it because you kind of wanted to be on the show or you were just reminding me or whatever, but we hadn't really convened in some time. And we actually met over an episode of Sacred Symbols Plus, which is ironic. And now we're engaged. So look at that. My dearest, today we discuss The Last of Us Part 1, which came to PlayStation 5 just earlier this month in September. And we just finished playing it. I am about to platinum it. I only need the trophy for constructing and then destroying the 5 various types of weapons you can upgrade. And apparently there's a video where I need to go and just go to these various places because I didn't fight I don't melee fight very often in the game, but we thought it would be fun to discuss this game in a review discussion / spoilercast. And we'll do it a little bit differently because I've talked about this game ad nauseum throughout my career. A lot of people have heard me talk about this game. So instead what I did was I of course organized your inquiries from Patreon. Remember, you can support us on Patreon. You're listening to this on Patreon, probably patreon.com/laststandmedia. And I have a couple of pages of your inquiries we'll get through. But I also just wrote, as I was playing the game on my computer, I just wrote a bunch of notes. Like these are all, each line is a different thing that I was thinking as I was playing or wanted to talk about. And I thought we would get into some of those as well. But Micah, to begin, Adam Razik wrote into us on Patreon and says, "Hello, Colin and Micah. I would be interested to hear Micah's history with The Last of Us. When did she first play the game? What were her initial experiences with it? And how did she feel about part 2 if she's played it?" So this is important setup, especially because I should note at the top, we will spoil The Last of Us here. Micah's never played The Last of Us Part 2. I will let her talk about that, but we will not be talking about that game here. So there will be no spoilers. It's really not relevant to this experience. It's in the inverse relevant, of course. So talk to us a little bit, Micah, about your history with The Last of Us and how you came into the PS5 version, having played it previously, presumably.
Sure. So I originally played it on PS3. I was late to playing it. I didn't play it until after Left Behind had come out because I played that very quickly afterwards. I was a huge 360 person at that time. So I was resenting the amount of hype that Last of Us was getting, and I was just sick of hearing about it. And at a certain point I said, fine, I'll just play it and see if it really is that good. And I loved it. I played it once on PS3. I played it twice on PS4 to get as many trophies as possible. I just completely fell in love with it and immediately understood why it was so beloved. But no, I haven't played part 2. I think I'm softening on it. I was mostly just angry that the game got spoiled for me. And I just at the time was just like, forget it. Like, I don't want to pay full price to play this game that I know the whole story, basically. But I think like playing part 1, it really has made me more curious about part 2. And I think I'm softening a bit to maybe finally playing it.
That's great to hear. There are little pieces of part 2 and part 1 that you wouldn't necessarily know. Like the workbench stuff is pulled right out of part 2. For instance, in the part 1 PS5 remake, Ben Williams wrote in and said, "Colin, can you just go on a rant about what makes this game so special? The conversation for this game is often so negative, yet it's one of the best of all time. Insert some positivity into the conversations." People don't often ask me to insert positivity into conversations. I will be happy to do that, though. Michael, like you, I encountered this game early, and I actually remember when it was announced very well at the Game Awards. I believe it was 2011's Game Awards. And so one of the first ones. And I remember they released that image. And in fact, there's a suite of images. Like after you beat the game, you can go in all the extras and stuff. And that image of the newspaper dispenser with the Last of Us newspaper in it, that was like the first image they'd ever released. And it brought back a flood of memories about how excited I was. And it's funny looking at the key art for the game, like Ellie and Joel in the street and stuff, you can see that they changed them as often happens during development, and not only in the PS5 version, but just the original PS3 version. In my estimation, and I'm totally happy to die on this hill, I feel like The Last of Us is one of the greatest games of all time. I mean, I don't think there's any question. I think the second one, and again, we will not spoil or talk about the second one here, but I think the second one's even better. And is one of the only games I've played since The Last of Us that in any way even tried to meet the quality of The Last of Us. I bring up this idea, Micah, and you know, this notion I invented in my mind of production per square inch. And many games don't demand that much production per square inch. For instance, the 2D NES and SNES style games we make at Lilymo have a pretty consistent production level per square inch because we're using flat geometry and we're creating kinetic gameplay and all of that. But when you're making an open world or something explorable that's not totally linear, that's trying to tell you a story that feels lived in, like something happened here, The Last of Us really only is met in some way by games like BioShock and BioShock Infinite and a select few others that get anywhere close to the level of quality. And I think what surprised me the most in going back to it, and I guess I should bring up Hank Kimbin wrote in about this. He says, "Hey, Colin and Micah, are you surprised how well this game holds up even after almost 10 years? In my opinion, it would still be a favorite to win Game of the Year if it came out today for the first time. Did the industry not advance that much in those last 10 years, or was The Last of Us simply so far ahead of its time? Both." The answer is both. Am I surprised that the game holds up so much? Not so surprised, because in 2019, I played through the game on PS3 again for Knockback, and I never played the game on PS4 very much. I reviewed it on PS4 at IGN, but I just played it a little bit on a debug kit because I had already played PS3 and the PS3 version and left behind. So for me, Micah, what I think is so surprising and what my rant would really be about is, like, it's surprising that it's not surprising that this game holds up still so well, that it still is a benchmark game. And that to me is stunning. I'm wondering, as a core gamer like yourself, do you feel the same way? Do you feel like this game, being 9 years old now, more than that, is still a game to beat?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest things for me was playing this sort of early-ish in when I was really getting into gaming again. I got heavily into Xbox around 2011. So playing this a couple of years later, it was still one of the first games I played that had a phenomenal story, a story that really impacted me, that made me angry, made me sad. It was one of the first games I encountered that I said, this is too good to just be a game. This should be a book. This should be a movie. And so for me, it really was just a further introduction to what video games could be. Like, my very first example of that was Red Dead Redemption, and realizing, like, this is what games are. You know, I was used to Mario Kart and Kirby, and finding out that this is possible, that there's these huge story-driven, exciting games. And then there's just the actual mechanics of it, the quality of it. The, like, guns in Last of Us just feel incredible to use. You don't feel too powerful based on the enemies around you and your limited resources, but it feels just so grounded. And I absolutely just love playing this game, and playing it again now. I'm almost even thinking of just doing like a New Game Plus playthrough on hard, because I just want to get back into it again. There's something about this game that's just too good.
It's special, especially because there's so much of it that you remember. There's a lot of it that we don't remember, of course, and we'll get into that later. If someone asked about that, the things that surprised us most, because though I've played through the game several times in my life, it is still new. It really is one of those fun experiences, even with The Last of Us Part 1's upgrades, which people would argue about the usefulness or even the volume of those upgrades. I still feel like it was a really special experience all the way through. And I think the reason why it hasn't been met in some way is because it's hard to do. I think what I'm reminded of, the more I learn about video games, like, I know so much more about video games now than I did when this game came out. And I knew a lot about games then, of course, but I can't help but look at the game through a different lens now and just be so impressed by how much work goes into moments. I was thinking about when they're in the tunnels in Utah and they're like in the flooded tunnel and the bus drops, and then like there's so I was just thinking about that. I'm like, this is so unnecessary. Like, people want to get to the hospital, but what you got, and you see it, right? But what they've done is they're like, no, we're going to put all this work into this crazy scene where Ellie almost dies. and then this kind of redemptive scene beforehand where you see the giraffe and and there's just so much work. And I don't think people understand how hard it is to make a game like this. And that's why I thought The Last of Us Part 2 was so impressive, because I was like, Jesus, it's twice as big as the first one, but it's even deeper. And so I just think it's a special sauce in the genetics of Naughty Dog. I think the games are really expensive to make. I don't think a lot of publishers want to spend that much money to make it. I don't think they make as much. They're not making as much profit as you think on these games. They're making a nice amount of money, but they can make much more money making a popular SOCOM free-to-play game that people actually played. So I think you have to have a willing publisher, like a willing patron, to make a game like this as well. And it's frankly why I want more of it, because I feel like it's Ken Levine's BioShock is really the only other stuff that met this bar of quality in terms of storytelling and immersion in games. Like nothing comes close. There's a bunch of great stuff out there. Resident Evil 2 remake. I'm sure Resident Evil 4 remake is going to be really atmospheric and all that, but there's just something about this one. But before we get any deeper, I do want to nip the big question in the bud here, Micah, and it's the price tag of the game, because everyone wants to talk about it. Ed Crusad wrote into us and said, The Last of Us is my favorite game of all time, but having played it so many times and beating Part 2, I don't know if I want to shell out $70. Even if the game looks absolutely gorgeous, I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this. Thank you, Ed, for writing in. So this is like all the rage, the cost of the game. You and I both paid out of our pockets for this game. And that's a rule on Sacred Symbols for us. It's not a rule for you. I mean, you can do whatever you want with your money, but you did the same thing. You like buying your physical games. I don't buy physical games, so that was not satisfactory for you. So $70, do you feel like it was worth your $70? Or do you feel like there is some merit to the contention that this game is simply too expensive?
So playing through it, I feel like it was worth the money. That is partly my own thing of, I still collect physical games. I love adding to my game collection, but I do often wait for games to go down in price, depending on if I'm not going to play it right away. This was, though, a must play for me. I just had to play it now, regardless of, us doing the show about it. I just really wanted to play this day one. And I do feel like the experience is worth the price. Being able to play it on the newest hardware, the newest controller, and having it look it just looks incredible. And the mechanics all feel great. Everything about the experience was worth it to me. I did not finish the game and say I should have waited a few months for the price to go down. Like, I absolutely didn't feel that way after.
I don't know, man. It's hard for me to talk about because in some way, because I don't want to sound flippant, but I do get caught up sometimes in the argument over price when it becomes all consuming. Like, are we really that worried about $10 or $20 that it becomes the central focus of the analysis of the product? It's not like they went out and said, this is $150. And everyone's like, what the fuck are you talking? $150. What they basically said is, no, it's the same price as every other first party and second party PlayStation 5 game that's come out so far. And that's what I've been saying to people. I don't want to make excuses for companies, but you can at least see the strategy of them saying, we can't make any excuses. Because the second we say, oh, this game's actually $50 or this game's $60, and people are going to be like, whoa, what about this? Like, if they made this game $40, let's say, when Factions comes out, which is going to be $70, I want people to prepare themselves for that. They're going to be like, whoa, what's going on here? Why is this game $70? At least this time around will be like, well, there it is. I mean, it's a $70 price point of Demon's Souls, of Returnal, of Ratchet and Clank, of all of these different things. And I do think that the Ratchet and Clank remake in 2016 on PS4, while very successful critically and commercially, was maybe a mistake for Sony to do in some sense, because they never actually explored that middle ground. They just opened it up and made people wonder, where are the games in this space? And so maybe they should have just been like, we should have just charged $60 for this game. Like, what was the point of even charging $40 for it? So I think there's just some corporate strategy there. But when you're getting caught up in $10 or $20, each dollar is valuable. I like to save my money too. And I wait for prices. And I said about Saints Row, for instance, like, I'm not paying $60 for Saints Row. But Saints Row isn't The Last of Us. And to me, it just seems quibbling to worry about that. I understand if people want to wait, but in some sense, if you have PlayStation Plus right now, you can just play The Last of Us for free. So, in fact, there's nothing to really be complaining about, because not only are they saying buy this upgraded version, support the new vision and all of these kinds of things, but if you really have a huge problem with that, just play the old one free of charge. It's not a big deal. So to me, I just feel like the price point argument is overwrought. Do you agree with that or disagree?
No, I agree, partly because I also am someone who says paying for the experience that I want to play it right now is part of what I'm paying for. Instead of waiting several months, I'd rather just play it right now. And that's sort of your own value decision of, do you want to play it immediately or do you want to wait? And it isn't the central talking point that I want to make about the game. I don't think the cost should be the main thing we're discussing. It should be the game itself. Is it high quality? What was it worthy of being released is more of the question than is it worthy of the price it was given. Like, was this project worthwhile? Did they actually accomplish what they set out to do? I think that's more where you should be talking about it versus is it just worth, the price that they set?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if in some sense this even represents a ceiling. Like I think the potential for $80 games and above are possible. I don't want to wish that into existence or say that that's necessary, but when you think about the inflationary situation right now, all of that money has already been gobbled up. That $10 increase is just gone. It's as if it never happened. They'd be in real trouble if they never did that, by the way. That would be an even more serious problem, them already really upping the price of the console in an unprecedented fashion. There's one other thing I wanted to ask you from a semantic standpoint before we get into the game. Dr. Shadi Haddad wrote in and said, Colin, when it was rumored that Last of Us Remake was in development in early 2021, I remembered you being very opposed to the idea, citing that this project isn't necessary. Now that you've played it, have your thoughts changed? Was this worth Naughty Dog's time, or should they have spent time on other projects? My suspicion about this game is that the story behind how it was developed is more complicated than it seems. I think what ended up happening was Visual Arts, that Michael Mumbauer team. He's obviously gone now. He went and made That's No Moon, and now he's working with John Garvin on Ashfall. But his team was working on this game. And I think at some point, either that team was reshuffled, or what I think happened is that The Last of Us, having a ton of internal power in the family, was like, no, we'll do it ourselves. And that's what I think happened. And they do like messing around with new hardware. Remember, The Last of Us was ported to PS4 in part to learn the PS4's hardware. So they might be learning something from this as well. This might strengthen their ability to make their next game, whatever it is, Factions, I'm sure, and then whatever's beyond that. So I don't necessarily think it was a bad idea. I do understand what people are saying, because it does take resources. Something done means a bunch of other things aren't or isn't done. And I do get that argument. I make that argument all the time. But do you have any problem with Naughty Dog not spending their time on something new?
No, not at all. I'm not the biggest PlayStation gamer. So for me, I'm like, sweet, this is one game that I'll play on the console. There's not a ton of other ones that I'm like looking forward to, or that I'm, so I don't feel like it was a waste of time by any means, because for me, it's like, this is one of the few games I'll play on PS5 this year.
All right. I'm going to my notes. I'm going to start reading these off. Let's see what we think about some of these. One thing I realized, and I think one of the things that's fun about playing a game like this and kind of knowing a story, is that you can focus on other things. Like, things are going on, you get it, but you're focusing on the negative space, as it were, where things aren't happening or where the interpretation lies and all of that. And I don't know why I never picked this up, but the first thing I wrote was, if the brothers stopped to help that family in the beginning, they would have avoided the accident and the death of Sarah. I don't know if I ever noticed that. Is that something you realized early on? So for people that, and you all hopefully have played the game, in the beginning of the game, when they're running out of their house, they meet up with Tommy and they're driving, and there's that family on the side of the road that's asking for help, and Sarah wants to pull over, and I think Tommy wants to pull over, and Joel's the one that tells him to keep going. But if they stopped there, who the hell knows what would have happened? A whole new butterfly effect would have opened up. But they wouldn't have been in that space and time where where the car would have gotten hit, where Sarah would have been killed by the soldier. I never really considered that. Do you find that intentional? That was like an intentional signal that they did the wrong thing and they got bit in the ass for it?
I don't want to say they did like the wrong thing, but I agree. I think it probably was a marker of like, if you'd shown a little compassion here, even if they just stopped and just spoke to the family, just those few seconds, like you said, it would have completely changed the next few moments and where they ended up. So it feels intentional in the way that, yeah, it's a very big decision that they made to ignore that family. And for me, it's the beginning of Joel going down a rather selfish path. And he has to do that to survive. But that's the first one, is he ignores a family in need and says, no, I'm taking care of myself and my family. And that does feel just very intentional, in that this is the real first moment that we see that attitude.
Yeah, there's a real casualness in this game about life and death in some way, which is what makes it so scary, because it makes you feel the deaths, the gurgling of the strangled soldier and all the shooting in the head. And I thought that the work with like the blood splattering and all of that, which I think is advanced in this game compared to the PS3 version, was like insane. I was like, holy shit. It looks like horrifying. It's not like, the body. What was I? I was playing Cyberpunk recently, right? Where the enemies, like, no matter what, I was showing Micah, like, no matter how you killed them, every time they would ragdoll in ways that made no sense. Yeah. And this game is the total opposite. Imagine this game where it didn't have that kind of death, where people's heads weren't blown off and they weren't sputtering and talking to each other and all this kind of stuff. But it shows there's just the primal reduction of a society that's lost all mooring, and it becomes just like nature. Speaking of this situation about his path of selfishness, and Joel, of course, being a very complicated protagonist, I just wrote here, 20 years, a long time not to know what happened. Where does your mind go? Because to me, that's one of the great things about The Last of Us, and one of the fascinating things, and one of the things I give them some credit in never answering, which is like, what the fuck happened? You get 20 years is a long time. 20 years is a really long time. And you see October 2013 in Texas, the outbreak begins, Sarah dies, Tommy and Joel are together, something, and then who knows? And then 20 years. And all of that is not even discussed in any way, like only a little bit here and there. It's insinuated Joel was incredibly violent and dangerous during that time, that he did what they needed to do to survive. And you don't last 20 years in this situation without being incredibly brutal, but it opens my mind up to a whole reservoir of possibility. And it's a place, I kind of, people don't want more Last of Us, but I kind of do, because it's like, you could do a prequel, right? That would be dope. Nonetheless, continue the story from part 2. So how do you feel about that? Where does your mind go, Micah, when you think about that 20-year, that 2-decade gap where everything falls apart, but we don't ever see it?
Well, so that is the part 2 that I honestly wanted, because I did not want them to expand on the ending of The Last of Us. I was very content with, this is it, and this is where we leave it, and you don't explore it further. But I was always hoping for a prequel and finding out more about Joel and Tommy, finding out where they broke off, because, I mean, that's a huge decision, that these are two brothers who have been through a lot together. And at a certain point, they have this falling out. And I always wanted to know more about that as well, more about that relationship, how it fell apart, how Joel, meets Tess and, these other characters. So I always wanted to explore that more. And that's really where the direction I always hoped that they'd go in. I don't think we'll ever see it, because it is a bit more fun to have it be a mystery, I suppose. But it's such a huge chunk of time. And in some ways, though, we know that this world is kind of like stagnant, because suddenly everything's just fallen apart. So it's not 20 years like we think of 20 years in our lives of going from, technological advances, all these things. These people are kind of stuck in the same state for a very long time. But that's interesting in its own way to explore and to see what life was like in the checkpoints they had to go through and all those things.
Yeah, I wrote here, there's crime but there's government and order and safety, and then the Fireflies, there's resistance. The United States is a really interesting place to have everything fall apart in fiction, I think specifically because of gun culture. That's what makes it so boring. If you were to have like a zombie outbreak story, I'm sure they exist, but if you had like a zombie outbreak story in Norway or something, it's like, well, that's actually really scary because you're much more defenseless, but there's not this arms culture and all this stuff where something else sprouts in the ashes necessarily. And so I think that there's a lot of open room there for them to explore. And I give them credit for never really going there. They do a little bit. I write actually later on that Tess and Joel have interesting conversations with each other when they're with Ellie about how there were rumors and rumblings of cures in the past, that the Fireflies have actually been chasing this for a long time. We learned that when you go to Utah and you hear some of the stuff in the hospital as well and read some of the stuff there, but that they've like heard all this before, that so much time has passed that it's not like someone coming out of the woodwork and being like, we have a cure. And everyone's like, wait, what do you mean? After 20 years, it's like, no, we've heard, like, how many times have they must have heard this? And so to find Ellie and for her to have the bite mark on her wrist and for her to have the proof that like, it's like, I was bitten. Then for us to learn about how that happened and Left Behind, it's all quite fascinating how they pick and choose which past pieces to tell. And interesting that they choose to go backwards to tell Ellie's story, but never Joel's, right? So I wanted to throw that out there as well. How about the gameplay? In fact, Hidari Shitaro wrote in and said, hey there, MC. Did you notice many of the gameplay changes or did they fly under your radar? The shooting itself didn't feel different from when I platinumed the remaster early this year, but additions such as auto-completing stealth kills when seen were greatly appreciated. Love you both and hope to see Micah in more content. Me too. She will be in more content. Thank you, Hidari, for writing in. Talk to me a little about the gameplay. I wrote that it still feels heavy and hard to watch. One of the things that I really loved about the original game, and I remember really going into in my review at IGN, was I don't think I'd ever played a game that made you feel death in some way. Like, we are very flippant and casual, like I've been using those words today, about killing in games. That's why I really like non-violent games, and I especially like games that make you or allow you to choose whether you want to be violent or not, which I think is really fun. And when games falsely present that to you, it's a little boring. This game doesn't falsely present that to you. You can actually get through entire parts of this game without fighting, which I think is pretty cool. But the gameplay feels heavy. It's scary when someone sees you and they begin talking to each other, and communicating. They hear I love when they hear the click of the gun and they're like, she's empty or he's empty or whatever. And a lot of really, really guttural, scary, heavy, almost survival horror style gameplay. How did you feel about the gameplay going back to the game? And did you notice any of the differences as you played?
So in terms of how the game felt to play, I didn't notice a huge difference. I haven't played it, though, in several years. I did notice things like I thought the workbench animations were new. I was like, I thought these are just taking longer than I remember when you like modify weapons and things. And it was cool. I really liked that a lot. But it is just, as someone who usually goes in guns blazing, this is one of the few games I try to be stealthy. I failed most of the time. But there's the fear of you. Yes, you hear the enemies talking, and then you are completely aware when they know that you're in the room. They're not just totally stupid. It's not the type of AI that you can just, trick and manipulate. They really do just impart this fear in you of like, I don't want to be seen. I don't want to be caught. And especially, I'm still terrified of the clickers. I remember the first time I saw them in the PS3 version, I screamed. And that feeling of dread when they're in the same room as me and I hear them coming and I'm, desperately like looking for a brick to throw to get them away from me, that feeling, it's like electric. And after playing this game, this is the fourth time I've played, I still felt that way. So the sound design is incredible, first of all.
Oh, yeah. We'll get into that. I definitely want to talk about the audio. The 3D audio is exceptional. I agree. It's fun in looking back at the extras in the game when you can unlock them with points you earn and see, art and all the rest. The evolution of the design of the clickers and the infected is just so cool because they really did start out more zombie and totally dumb. And they embrace this like fungal, floral, weird, I don't know. I love how like they're attached to the walls and you can see them grow. Like it's not just the body itself, but the way it grows in this almost root, like it's like Metroid-ish in some weird way in my mind. And I just love that they've stumbled upon the appropriate design for these characters right on up to the bloater. And I love also that they explain in some way how they become this way. In other words, the runners are like the newly infected. And then the clickers are the ones that have been infected for a really long time. And then the bloaters are the ones that have been infected presumably since the beginning, which is incredible. And how you only really encounter them in sensical ways. Like you'll only encounter bloaters or clickers in like tunnels where they've been forever, but not roaming around where you would run into runners. So there's a real logic to the way you see enemies and they're presented, which I love too.
Definitely.
Yep.
I also feel it adds to the storytelling in the way of when you see one of these creatures that you're like, all right, this is an old one. It also means that probably no one's been through here in a very long time, especially like when you're at the college campus and you're seeing these enemies. It's like no one's been through here in a very long time, or at least no one made it out alive in a very long time, because there are these ones in here that are very old. And I just like that as part of the storytelling too, of when's the last time someone was here. We're the first ones to be seeing this space in a while.
Right. It's there's something about that too where, and I mean, it's obvious, but because so much time has passed, you're going through these places that have been combed over so many times that you almost get frustrated. Like, where is everything? Like, why can't I find an item? And then it's like, well, dude, I mean, you're like probably the 100th person to come through here looking for something. And so you found like a little piece of a scissor or something. It's like, okay, there you go. Everyone else took, and I love that. You see that in Left Behind, I think, really acutely when Ellie is going, it's flash forwarded to the game, but where Ellie's in the pharmacy looking for things and it's like everything's gone and she can't find shit. And then she gets into the door and finds the med kit, but even that's empty. And I loved that because I was like, of course, dude, like, what do you think? That was picked clean in 2014 and it's 2000. What would it be? 2033, I guess, in the game. So yeah, I really dig that stuff too. I'm glad that you share that. And some of the storytelling and the story building too I wrote here I liked as well. Marlene and Tess know each other, and Marlene and Tommy know each other, and it brings in the Fireflies and all of this. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Fireflies and the interconnectivity between these characters. What do you make of the Fireflies? At this point, you don't know much about them. You know much more about them in the second game. What do you think based on what you know? Like, they're a resistance group. They seem to be perhaps weakening because as we go through the game, we are not finding them where they're supposed to be. So clearly they're retreating. They're leaving notes and evidence behind of their activities. They're getting overrun. We finally find them in some coherence in Utah. And that's what I really like about that St. Mary's Hospital is it feels like the only place in the entire game where it's been taken care of in some sense. So it's not like a mess. And so I'm wondering, what do you make of all of that, of the different machinations of the Fireflies? But other than seeing a logo here and there, we find the dog tags, etc. We don't know very much about them.
No, and for me, that's definitely still part of the mystery of the game, and part of it wondering why they're so violent. Because on the very surface level, the Fireflies are supposedly the ones that are still looking for a cure. The government seems to have, basically given up on finding a cure. They're really focused on keeping people in the quarantine zones, keeping them just within this space, and what's happening outside just feels like it's out of their hands. So it feels like the Fireflies are the only ones who are actively still hoping to find a cure and working towards that. But it makes you wonder what happened that they are the enemies for doing that. What happened that they need to have such a strong resistance to the government? In what way are doctors the bad guys for trying to find a cure? So for me, that's a lot of mystery. It definitely is. It's when I first played the game, I didn't sympathize with them at all because I was like, oh yeah, they're terrorists. Essentially, they're causing all this mayhem. And then playing it, each additional time, it just really makes you think like, why are these guys the bad guys? They're trying to find a cure. They're trying to do the right thing, help mankind, and it just makes me wonder more and more, and also makes me want to play the second one more and more to get some of these answers that might be out there.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that because you've waited long enough, and it's the second one. Oh my goodness, I love it. So, and before we move on from that, I also want to kind of say to your point, it's like they're not the bad guys. They're not. They're the resistance to this overburdening Fedra. Like we don't actually ever really see Fedra either. That's what's so interesting is in The Last of Us. Or in Left Behind is the closest we ever get to seeing them because Ellie is with them, but we only see her in her bunk. We don't see anyone else. She escapes and goes to the mall with Riley and all of the rest, we learn that Riley joins the Fireflies, so they're arch rivals, or they're supposed to be, even though it doesn't really matter to them. So we don't really get a full read of either side, which is so interesting. Like it's clear that both sides, based on what you find throughout the game, are losing because they're both fighting the infected much more than they're fighting each other, and they're losing that battle slowly. And I dig the idea of finding their little, their pennants, their dog tags as you go, as they, the losses pile up for them, and kind of adds to the gravitas of not seeing them again when you're supposed to, which I dig. And as we go through the game, Micah, I wanted to ask you about kind of the urban and cultural decay and the environment's disinterest in humans. This is one of the things I love the most, because I never really wrapped my mind around this until I read, I think it's called The World Without Us or something. It's on the bookshelf in the loft if you want to read it one day. But it's about like how surprisingly quickly the Earth would make it so that you were never here. If you stopped doing everything, it would happen way quicker than you think. And I think that this game kind of shows that in a way that's challenging, because I want to challenge it. I want to be like, wait a minute, it's only been 20 years. The fuck are you talking about? Like, how is Boston this obliterated? But then you realize it's like, no, first of all, they've been bombing the city. Second of all, I love that one shot of the building leaning against the other building. I think it's awesome. And it's like the second pipes start bursting and water's flowing and all of the rest, it's over. I mean, of course, it's going to happen quickly. Everything starts getting reclaimed. Dirt starts piling up. Things start growing. I love that stuff. And so I think The Last of Us, though, it challenged my perception. I'm like, I don't think it would be this bad. It's like, no, it would probably be like this. I'm wondering what you think about that world and if it's appealing to your sense of aesthetic.
Oh, for sure. I absolutely love going into these, urban environments, and it's been taken over with vegetation. That's always just one of my favorite things in movies and everything, is the complete, nature reclaiming these spaces. And I think maybe my favorite example of that is the hotel, and just the way that it's just decimated. And as you mentioned, like the water, there's parts of it that are flooded. There's vegetation, in the entrances and everything. And it really doesn't take that long when you have, like, if these buildings were sealed up, they would still look good inside. But it's like, no, from the moment this whole, infection and everything started, people were smashing windows and, hiding away in places. And now the elements are getting in. It's totally, for me, believable, just because it's like, look at this space and see that all the windows are smashed. The doors are gone. There's nothing keeping the elements out. And it's only in like the upper floors of the hotel where there's some normalcy. Things are dirty. And there's, like broken glass everywhere. It's like, it's not a great place to be, but it's not taken over by nature in the same way that the entrance and the lower levels are. So you can see sort of the contrast of the spaces where people were actually living and attempting to maintain versus the spots that are just completely deserted and have been taken over, like the lower level, like the subway station and everything. I really dig that. I thought it's just a big part of the storytelling, and it's a big part of what makes it feel like it has been a long time since this introduction when you were with Sarah in the beginning.
Yeah, very well said. Let's head back to the inquiries from the audience. El Plantano Pantera de San Wakando. I hope you didn't make me say something racist. Says, hello, sacred sycophants. What was your favorite moment you forgot, or just in general? So I want to focus on that forgotten moment before we get any further into my notes. Is there any moment in the game, since you have played it in the past, like I have, that cropped back up that reminded you? I was like, oh, this is really cool. I forgot about this. Is there a moment that comes to mind for you?
Definitely. So my favorite section of the game is Billstown, but I had forgotten why. And part of that is just, it's Bill himself, his personality, his snarkiness, and the way him and Ellie kind of like mince words with each other. And I had forgotten that. I was looking forward to that part, but I couldn't remember exactly why I loved it so much. And then it's when Ellie meets Bill and she's just being a smart ass, and, he's very sarcastic, and it made me chuckle. In a very dark and heavy game, those moments made me laugh. And I had just completely forgotten why I liked that section so much.
Yeah, that is a really cool spot. It's booby trapped. I like skulking around the town. You find the notes that he's leaving for himself, which I think is pretty cool, and kind of scolding himself for being lazy. You obviously learn about his relationship with this guy, and it's very sad. It's actually, sadder than I remembered.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's because it plays out much more with the facial animations and all the rest and all the upgrades that they've done to the aesthetic, which I think just raises the height of the emotion in the game. But yeah, that's a really wonderful spot to think about too. I was thinking about the Ish storyline, which at the time, I mean, of course I remember that, but I remember that being the in vogue, this should be the DLC kind of move. When the game came out, everyone was like, let's learn about this story with Ish and all of that. But what I forgot about that whole storyline, that whole through line and playing through it, was how deep it goes. I remember that they go into the sewer and they find kids and stuff, but then you get out and you look behind you and it says like, this place is sealed because there's infected in it. So you're going through it backwards. Then you go into the neighborhood next door and you find that that's where they were getting a lot of the kids from and all of this. So it's a huge through line through maybe, I don't know, 1/6 of the game or so. That's pretty cool. And I had forgotten how deep that goes and how you would never get any of that if you didn't go for the collectibles.
I was just going to say,
Please.
I completely agree with this playthrough. I was extremely thorough, so I did get all those details. I definitely, in other playthroughs, was not as thorough as I was in this one. So I would have gotten bits and pieces, but this was the first time I got what I believe to be the full story of it. And it was horrifying. It really sunk in with every note that I found of just how awful this was.
It's cool because you learn how this guy was out at sea when everything went down, had to eventually come back probably months later. And then he kind of tries to create a normal situation in this sewer system where they have kids and they're teaching them and they have a little kindergarten or whatever and daycare. And there's the order. And it's cool when you go around their little settlement, you read I don't know if you did, you read the various boards, like the rules on them. And there's a lot there. There's a lot more there than I remember, because I remember being at the time being like, yeah, that would be cool. Let's see what Ish was doing in the beginning and getting this together. But I didn't realize how clever it was that you were working kind of backwards through all of it. You're starting where he started, but then you're kind of seeing it through opposite eyes because it goes around that thing, ends up in the town and goes through the other direction. So I just loved that you're fighting them, basically. One of them is potentially Ish, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah, pretty cool stuff. So that was one of the biggest surprises that I didn't remember that I really liked. I want to talk about, and I just wrote it here, your watch is broken. The symbolism of the watch. What do you make of that? That 20 years later, I love that the watch is broken. Something happened to it at some point. He jokes around how it was broken in the beginning, but it wasn't. He still wears it. Yet he seems to have compartmentalized that entire part of his life. Just refuses to even mention Sarah. And 20 years is a long time. You could imagine that he might go through days at a time without thinking about her at this point, that he's maybe moved on, or potentially maybe he's not. What do you think about that symbolism? I always loved that he wears that watch.
It's really just one of the saddest things to me. It's heart-wrenching because this is a really tough guy. He's done horrible things. There's they allude to him at one point being, like one of the hunter type guys. Like, he has really done horrible things, but here he is wearing this broken watch that his daughter gave him that he just can't let go of. And he doesn't want to talk about Sarah. He doesn't want to think about Sarah, but he cannot get rid of this one little thing. And so for me, it's just incredibly sad when we talk about like being sort of, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. My phone just made a sound. When you talk about being like desensitized to things, especially like in games, part of the storyline with Ish being that there's the moment where you find the classroom and there's a note from the teacher, type person saying that if they don't get help soon, they will make sure that the kids are taken care of quickly. And you can just read that note and put it down and walk away. And then you realize this is horrifying. And so for me, that's the watch. It's like when you just look at it on the surface, it's a dad wearing a watch that his kid gave him. And then when you really think about it, it's like, this is just this one thing he cannot let go of, this one thing he refuses to put aside. And it's really, really sad.
The one thing that is weird to me, although I understand why they don't let you do this, it reminds me a little bit of Fallout 3 when there was that, it's a spoiler for Fallout 3 if anyone cares, but and I don't know what it is for the story, like its potential for the importance of the story, but there's a colony of children in the game and you can't shoot any of them. And like you can aim at them, but you can't put them in vats or like, try to kill them or whatever. Like the game will just not let you do it because I guess that would be a step too far for ESRB or whatever. But one thing I felt like the game was missing were children infected. And I know that that's really dark, but that particular ish dungeon when you're underground, that should have been mostly kids. That would have been fucked up. And I wonder like what the real, like, are they doing that because of the ESRB or are they doing that because it's just tasteless? But either way, that's what's missing. Where are the kids? I don't know if anyone else has ever thought about that, but I've thought about that a great deal. Like where young people in this situation at all, smaller people, old clickers, like old people, like there is like that missing element that doesn't quite keep it as grounded as I think it could have been. And it's scary to think about that entire section where it would have been mostly kids. I would have loved that. That would have been sick in more ways than one. All right, let's see what else is here. Oh, I wanted to talk a little bit about the controls. What did you think about the haptics using DualSense and all of that? I must say, I found it totally underwhelming. I didn't even really notice. This was one thing where I was like, I thought you were going to do way more cool stuff here. Having played some of the most sophisticated games on PS5 in terms of haptic feedback, this game doesn't even seem to do anything at all. And I was confused about that. Although I was reminded, although the game only made me do it once, I remember doing it more, is that I do love that thing where you have to hit the controller on your hand to get your flashlight going. I just think that's so clever. It's a little annoying, but it's kind of cool that they did something like that to kind of just get your mind awake. Like, oh, okay, I'm not just sitting here with my hands on a stick. But I was disappointed that there wasn't more effort put into the haptics. I'm curious if you noticed any differences to the controls and how you liked playing it on PS5.
Yeah, so the flashlight thing, first of all, terrified me every time. One of the times it did it was I was rounding a corner and there was, like a runner right around the corner and the flashlight goes out. And that was just brilliantly done, made me very afraid. I immediately like backed up, like took a moment to pause and go back. Like things like that were really cool. I didn't notice a ton with the haptics. And I'll say part of that, I'm someone who has played very little on PS5. So I was looking forward to seeing like what are they going to do with all these controller functions. So I was a little disappointed because I would have definitely noticed it because I hardly ever use the thing. I'm usually playing on Switch or on Xbox. So if they had really used a lot of the controller features, I would have noticed it. I would have been like really stoked about it. And it didn't feel like they did very much with it. It's, it feels great to play. And that flashlight mechanic really was cool. I liked that a lot. But I don't think they did as much with it as they could have because it didn't feel like anything super special.
What about crafting and upgrading? I mean, I think this is one of the coolest parts of The Last of Us because it happens in real time, which is cool. So you can't really pause the game. You can pause the game literally, but you can't pause the game and be in it. In other words, so you can't interact in menus or anything like that. You can't even read something without it being potentially happening in real time, being attacked while that's happening, which I love. I think that's really neat. But the game is really restrained. Like you would in some way you'd want to be like, there should be more things to find. Like, why am I finding the same 7 types of things or whatever? But it's limited enough where you kind of can use your imagination and say like, these are blades. These are, this is like, powdered ingredients. This is whatever. This is gauze and cloths and all these kinds of things. They're not necessarily the same. It's just kind of in the category. But I love that you can build things with them. And I was always afraid of Naughty Dog going too far with Uncharted and getting into this kind of realm, not only because of this game, but even before this game. I'm like, how long is it going to be before we're upgrading our weapons and leveling up Drake and all this kind of stuff? And I'm glad that even in this game, they really only go like 1 or 2 steps further than Uncharted. There is no leveling system. You have your vitamins that you take and all of the rest. You have your parts for your guns, and then you have these various collectibles that you can find in addition to crafting the items that you use. So I feel like it's quite the appropriate suite without making it feel like a game. I think that the interesting thing about The Last of Us is that it doesn't feel like a game. And I don't think that's neither good nor bad, but for this experience where I'm not looking to have fun, but looking for an experience, I feel like this is the perfect complement to it. So what do you think about the upgrading and all the rest?
Oh, I love it. I love crafting in games. I love searching for resources. That's my bread and butter. Those are my favorite things to do. Scour the environment, look for resources. It's incredibly rewarding to find them and then craft things. And we had sort of talked about our system of, in trying to maximize resources of, I would try not to craft things until I actively found them. So I'll have one med kit on hand. If I find, more like rags and alcohol, if I can't pick them up because my inventory's full, that's when I'll craft another med kit. That's when I'll craft another, Molotov. So I thoroughly enjoy that part of the game, and I love the crafting. I really love the weapon upgrades. Like that's what I look forward to the most, is finding all those resources, being really thorough with the environments. This was my first time playing the game where I was able to kind of control my fear and really search the environments. In previous playthroughs, I was trying to just get from A to B as quickly as possible. I wasn't eliminating as many enemies because I was just so terrified. This was the first time I really slowed down, really would clear out an area and then go search the place. And it made the resources, first of all, feel a lot more plentiful. And it also made the crafting and everything much more enjoyable because I actually had things to work with.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I adore that part of the game.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm a similar way where I only actually start crafting anything when I'm out of room, and then it's like, okay, well, now to pick up this scissor, you got to craft something. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to use, I'm always afraid of using things, especially shivs early on, because I'm afraid of missing a shiv door, which would be the worst. That would just bother me to no end if I did that. But yeah, I'm a similar, very deliberate way. And I would also try to get through the various combat parts. I would eventually accept if I messed up, but I was trying to get through these as stealthily as possible because that's how I feel like it would be most realistic for me, is to like just patiently move around the bookstore. But if someone found me after a while, I'd be like, okay, this is playing out realistically. They finally saw me. I'm fucking piling up bodies. And then there would be other things like I showed you in Utah when I was in the hospital, where I kept just getting these guys to go around this corner and I just kept piling the bodies up. I feel like there were like 6 bodies there and it was just so manipulative and stupid. But overall, I feel like everything plays really well into this realistic groundedness, like you said earlier. And with the vitamins, what did you upgrade first? I was telling you, I upgraded weapon sway first. It makes the game so much easier. Like when you upgrade twice fully to the weapon sway, your weapon just doesn't move at all. So it's as opposed to just wobbling back and forth. And when I was playing Left Behind, it was funny. It was like real shocking because I was at that end combat sequence in the mall. I'm fighting with Ellie and I'm like, Jesus Christ, stop moving. Like I couldn't aim anything. What did you choose to upgrade? Not only with the vitamins, but maybe tell me a little bit about your upgrades with your weapons as well.
Sure. So vitamins, first thing I upgraded was Shiv Master, which allows you to use a shiv to break when a clicker like has you in its clutches. That was the first thing I saved up for and upgraded. I saved weapon sway for last, but I didn't actually think it was a big deal until you had mentioned to me that you spent the money on. I was like, oh, all right, I'll try it out. But for me, it was just like, it's just how the game played, and I didn't mind it. I kind of actually liked it better when you had the weapon sway in there because it felt almost too easy afterwards.
Yeah.
But yeah, I started out with Shiv Master. I think I upgraded crafting speed way before I upgraded like max health. I immediately started just upgrading like crafting speed because for me, that's the number one thing. And then for my weapons, the pistols. I adore pistols in games. So those got maybe the most attention in terms of upgrades. The hunting rifle might be my all-time favorite gun in the game. Putting the scope on it, you're just immediately so much more lethal with it. The shotgun, I really like the guns in this game. It's maybe one of my biggest critiques in some games is when the weapons don't feel great. And it's why I don't like games when the gun feels like a pew pew laser rifle. I hate that. I don't want the gun to feel like a toy. I want it to feel like I'm going to obliterate somebody. And that's what Last of Us feels like. So the more you upgrade your weapons, you just become more and more deadly. And for me, I don't play very stealthily. So I really got to take advantage of that. I noticed a huge difference as you upgrade and go through the game. Suddenly you're just that much more powerful. You're still very vulnerable. The game never lets you feel like a superhero, but you notice the difference as you go through, and it's a really great feeling.
Yeah, you had brought up something that made me laugh, which is that he has a shit ton of weapons on him. It doesn't really make any sense. I think it would have been. I don't know if you play Grounded or one of these other modes. I never did, but it would be cool if you had to make a choice like not just in terms of having things available in your backpack for easy grabbing, but it's like if you want this sniper rifle, you have to drop one of your long guns permanently. And I think that would have been even cooler to be like, okay, you can have like maybe 2 pistols, 2 long guns, or 3 pistols, 2 long guns, something like that. I would have liked that a lot. I think the only place that they go overboard to make it feel unrealistic is with the flamethrower, which I think was just it's so stupid. I actually didn't use it at all in my playthrough in part 1, but to me that signals, and I'm really tuned into this sort of thing. It's like we got something working in our game and we want you to use it. And for that, it was like their amazing fire effects and people burning alive and all of that. And you can do that with Molotovs, but they're like, no, we really want you to see that. And I think that that's where the flamethrower comes from. And that's kind of where I was like, that's kind of, it feels stupid to have this in here, like just, and it's like leaning against a truck at the college or something. I think I'm like, what is this doing here? This doesn't make any sense. Situationally.
I completely agree. As soon as I picked it up, that was the moment that really felt like a game. That was the one that was like, this doesn't belong here, but it was a ton of fun to use, and I used it a lot. At first, I told myself, we're not going to use that weapon. It's silly. And then, you encounter a bloater and it just kills them very quickly. I'm like, this is fantastic. It's
just like with the raft parts where it's like, they got this to work. So now they're going to make you do it 5 times. I mean, I'm telling you, that's why it's in the game, Like they're going to replicate this several times. It's why I used to make fun of in Uncharted 4 where he's constantly sliding. And I'm like, oh my God, stop sliding. We get it. You got it to work. We get it. Please make Drake stop sliding. But all right, let's move on to some of these other things here. I want to go back to Billstown. You had mentioned Bill. I know this is your favorite part of the game. It's the part of the TV show I'm most interested to see as well. I love this idea of the booby trap town. Like we said, I love how quiet it is for them to get in there. They're kind of getting to know each other a little bit, talking. It's not till they're going to Pittsburgh that they really begin to open up more. So this is before that. But talk to me more about what you like in this particular town and Boston and I guess Massachusetts in general. You're from Massachusetts. So this first portion of the game, this fall portion, I guess it would be, right, is pretty compelling. And so I want to hear more about what you like about Billstown.
Sure. So Billstown, firstly, the setting. Now, I'm not from Boston specifically, but this place, it just felt homey. These little neighborhoods that you're going through, especially when you get to the high school, it just really makes me feel like home. And it makes me wonder what it would be like back home if that's where it was set. I'm from a very rural place. There's a lot of farmland. There are some, more suburban areas, but there's tons of just acres and acres of land. And that'd be a really cool place to have something like this set. One of my favorite parts about Billstown is just Bill himself. The very first time I played the game, I thought he was rude. I was like, why is this guy being so mean to us? And then you play it again, and there's the part where Bill's like, you're setting off all my traps. And it's like, yeah, we're kind of just ruining his day right now. We've stumbled into his town. We're setting off his traps left and right. He needs resources to rebuild those. It's a risk to his own health to go out and put those out and try and protect himself. It's like we really have just stumbled into his town. We're ruining everything. And then we're going to ask him for help. Because on my first playthrough, I'm like, this guy's just a dick. And then you meet him more and more and you're like, we're the ones that are in the way. He was just going about his business and we've just completely turned it upside down. So his actual, just who he is, how he's, really perturbed by Ellie, touching things in his house. He's got like his stack of comic books and he keeps telling her to leave him alone. I just really enjoy now his curmudgeonliness, and I didn't at first. And part of it too is just actually seeing how he's thrived in this space. We know that he makes deliveries for Tess and Joel, so seeing just how he has scoured the town for resources, he strategically leaves things in places. He has that spot where he keeps, extra weapons in a certain part of town, but it's not the same place where he sleeps. I just really like, as I've seen the game, each time getting new things from it, and really seeing how Bill was pretty legit at survival, and he had this place just set up, and it's a neat environment when you compare it to places like where the hunters are, and they seem to just be scraping by, versus Bill, who's kind of thriving in this like wilderness.
Yeah, in fact, he's overweight, which I think it's interesting that they point that out. I mean, Ellie says that to him, and that is interesting to me. Where it's like, how? or even in this, it's the processed like carbs and all of that make us fat. Like that stuff shouldn't even exist anymore. Like you should be, what are you eating, jerky or something? I don't know. You should be fine. So that I think that's very interesting too, that he seems to live pretty well. But you're right. I mean, there's two other interesting things I think about Bill, and that whole sequence is, the first is his relationship with Frank and how you kind of learn that he's like got this gay relationship. And it's really sad. It's actually maybe one of the saddest parts of the game where that guy like hated him. And you kind of learn that. The guy writes a suicide note. And it's not like I'm going to miss you and, see you on the other side and all that kind of stuff. It's like, fuck you, dude. I hate you. Like, I can't stand this. I'm going to kill myself instead of live like this anymore. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly sad. And the other thing that I'm interested in, and I'm curious what you think, is this is another example of a few examples where it is insinuated that Joel did something for him, because he doesn't say no. Ellie says to Bill, you owe Joel. And he kind of laughs it off, but it's clearly true. Have you thought about that and what might have happened? Did they ever really get into that? I know that it's like they have the commerce with each other, but it seems like there's something much deeper.
For sure. That's definitely one of the big mysteries for me, because that section of the game is one that I think about the most when I'm thinking about this game and remembering like key moments. Those are the conversations that always stick out to me. And it is this, Bill is this like real hard ass type guy. So it's like, why is he helping us? And he's willing to give us, maybe the last good car battery in town. And he's willing to give Joel that. It's like, this is a big favor. He owed him something huge. And so what is it? Because from the moment that he says, like, if I could fix up one of these cars, I'd do it for myself. And then he ends up helping you do just that. But it's like, that was a huge opportunity that he spent on us instead. So I definitely have wondered, like, what was it? What did Joel do? Did Joel help him get to that place, in the beginning and set it up as his own little town? Like, although no, because I think Ellie says Joel hasn't been there before. So it's like, what is it? There's so many things that it could be.
Yeah, it's again, it's all the texture. Like, I really give them a lot of credit for not really talking about, like, Neil or someone could write a fucking novel about all this stuff. Could make all this money, and they could have even made a spinoff of this stuff. So I give them a lot of restraint for not burying these stories. Although I would like for them to be answered one day. I understand why they're not, and I think it adds to the mysterious nature of Joel's moral disposition. Is he good or is he bad? He's clearly killed potentially hundreds of people. I mean, in the game, you killed dozens of people, at least scores of people. But he also has friends. Tess loves him. Bill obviously trusts him. He's got some sort of fear or renown. He's survived and gotten far. So can that happen only being the hard ass? He also insinuates that it was that Tommy was saved by his actions, that like he was so dark in part to save Tommy or they would have been killed early on. And he talks about how crazy it was early on. And again, that goes back to just the lack of understanding. How long has it been this decrepit? Has it been like this for 15 of the 20 years or something? Because it's potentially true. It could be that most everyone's dead. We also don't know that. We don't even know how many people are actually alive. Like, after all, it could be millions. It could be hundreds of thousands in the United States. And we certainly don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. That's good stuff. Two other notes about Billstown. I do love that apartment you find around that time where there's a note from Ezra to Rachel. Do you know what I'm talking about? And it's on a table and there's like a spray paint thing down to get her attention. I just love that environmental storytelling. I think that's really neat. And the T, when you're in the subway system, I lived in Boston for 5 years. Incredibly accurate. That's the red line. So the one that goes out towards Harvard and Cambridge. And I remember actually, because I went and looked, I wrote about it at IGN, that the T map in the game, I don't know if people remember this. This is like a little tidbit. The guy that made the T map got really mad that it was included in the game and like sued Naughty Dog and Sony over it, because it's not because I think Sony assumed it was like a free just in the domain, the public domain to use. And it wasn't. It was this guy's design. And so you guys can go read about it, and they kept it in the game, but I think they had to pay the dude. But it was cool to see those maps everywhere, because that brings me back to my days in college. And I was trying to zoom in photo mode on the maps. The resolution's not high enough, because I'm like, are they using the real stops? Because one of the stops on the green line is called Northeastern. All right, we had brought up audio earlier, and I got to talk about this 3D audio. So I'm wearing here, as we are doing our podcast, my Pulse headset for PS5, but I've only played 2 games in really any real way with these on. I played Horizon Forbidden West earlier this year, and then I played this game. And I tell people that, and you know, Micah, we live together, is that I like to multitask when I play games unless the game is really demanding of your attention with story. So if I'm playing like a shooter, I'll listen to a podcast or whatever in the background. And then if there's some dialogue or something's happening, a cutscene, I'll pause it, but then I'll get back into it. But every once in a while, I encounter a game where I'm like, I'm just going to sit here and play this game. And The Last of Us is one of those games. And so I wore my headphones, and I have to say, the 3D audio is exceptional. I mean, it's nuts how much it heightened the experience of the game, especially in combat. But the clickers and the ambient noise and all the rest, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible stuff. I really highly recommend it. I'm not a huge advocate of game audio. I think it's great. I obviously love the Mega Man bangers and the Castlevania bangers and all that stuff. But I really come from an era where that was a compliment, but not really necessary. When people ask me, what's your favorite score, or what songs did you like in Fallout? I'm like, I don't know what the fuck are you even talking about, dude. Like, I wasn't listening to that game. You know? But here, I just couldn't help but listen to it. And it's so wonderfully done. The dialogue, the delivery, the acting, just the sheer weight of your feet going over glass, concrete, snow, dirt. It's really wonderful stuff. Did you get to experience the wonders of the audio?
Definitely. Much like you, I'm usually listening to something else while I'm gaming. Part of that being, I play a lot of games that are voiced in Japanese, so why the hell do I need to hear it, because I have to read it anyways. So most of that time, I'm listening to a podcast or something, let's say, and this game, I initially thought that's what I was going to do, because I thought this is the 4th time I'm playing it. I know the story well enough. I said, I don't need to be completely present for this experience. But the first 5 minutes of the game, it just had me hooked again. And I shut off, the video that I was going to watch in the background. I was present with the game the whole way through. I didn't want to miss anything. And the sound design was a huge part of that. Not only because when you're trying to be stealthy, you really do need to hear everything. It's so immersive to actually be actively listening for the sound of footsteps or that one click, when they're far away and you can just barely hear the clickers coming, that first little noise that you hear. So I thoroughly enjoyed that part of it, of being really present with the game, not doing anything in the background for once. It also made me realize, like, man, maybe I'm playing games that I'm not as into because I am just so content to do something in the background all the time. This was the first time in a while that I felt completely invested in the experience. The one day I did play it with headphones because you were recording a different show and I didn't want the TV to be too loud. It was even more terrifying. And I didn't like that one bit. I did not play it with headphones again because it was too much for me. I really didn't enjoy feeling like I could actually hear, like, that the clicker was, in front of me, behind me. It made it so much more scary that I could not do that again, but it was cool to experience it.
Fair enough. To the dialogue, Maxi Lopez wrote in and said, "Hey, Colin and Micah, I don't know if I'm the only one here, but was more dialogue added to this remake? Me and my brother completed this game numerous times together in the past, and there were a few moments we didn't recall certain dialogue being said in the original. Wonder if you have also had this moment. The remake was incredible. I got the platinum in less than a week and played it with my brother, brought back good memories, and what a masterpiece." Thank you, Maxi, for writing in. So I had noticed this as well, but I would doubt that they recorded anything new. My assumption is, I have 2 assumptions about this, is that either it's situational, and I think it might be. So I would restart, like I said, checkpoints and encounters over and over again if it wasn't going the way I wanted it to, because I really wanted to, I was trying to fulfill some sort of story goal of being like, I got through this as minimally as possible. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for Joel fighting 10 different dudes, like straight up, he would die. So I was trying to stay within these, this arbitrary rule set, but I would restart it over and over again. What I noticed was that people were saying different things every time I would restart it. And even in story moments where you're crossing something and it's like, come on, let's cross this thing. They would say it 2 or 3 different ways. And so I think that might be what you were encountering, was just the various hodgepodge of inclusions, which just goes to show you how deep the game is, that there's dialogue that you'll never even hear, even though there's really very little optional encounter or a very optional, exploration in the game. So I think that's really cool. That's probably what you encountered, though. I want to talk about Pittsburgh. I love the drive to Pittsburgh. That's when Joel and Ellie are starting to actually get close to each other there in the car. They got from Bill. They got it going. They ran away from the clickers in the neighborhood. Pretty frightening encounter. And they're starting to finally get into a groove with each other. And I really enjoyed watching that and experiencing that again. She's laying back there. She's dicking around. She's got the nude, the man, you know, I don't want to say it's a gay man magazine. I don't know if it's that. It's just for it could be for women too, I guess. But, and then she talks about how the pages are stuck together, but she's only joking, and she throws it out the window, which I think is funny. And she's got her comic books and all the rest. And I really like that. And I love how juxtaposed it is to the bleakness of the encounter that they have there in Pittsburgh. People might remember that was another early thing we saw. In fact, I think that might be the first we ever saw the game running, was that cutscene when they're going into like the off ramp, and he decides to go down, and they run into the black guy and he's like, he's not even hurt, and, you know, runs him over. And that shit is nuts, because that was the first time we had really encountered a dangerous situation with survivors. Up to that point, you were fighting Fedra, you were fighting these people in that gang in Boston, then you were fighting the infected, and now you're fighting, like you said earlier, potentially a group very similar to the one Joel might have survived with and ran with for years up to this point. And I just love how they smash together like that. And the hotel encounter, which you brought up earlier, is probably my favorite part of the game. I think that was the E3 demo in 2012 when they're going into the window and skulking about the different rooms. I just absolutely love it. They see there's a scene where there's a couple, I think, dead in a bathtub, and Ellie says like they took the easy way out, and Joel says there's nothing easy about it. There's like a lot of really good stuff. They go into the basement. They're separated from each other. You're fighting the bloaters down there. It's really wonderful stuff. So I just love how the game starts to open your heart up a little bit, and you're kind of starting to get this relationship out of them. And then boom, they're in the convenience store. Joel almost gets his neck stabbed over the glass in the case. It's crazy stuff. What did you think about that whole section?
Yeah, so starting off with the survivor guy, he's faking being hurt. And for me, that's just another callback to Joel's experience. And it's the experiences that we don't know about. But, you know, Ellie very naively believes like this guy needs help. And Joel immediately knows it's a ruse. And it makes you think, like, why does Joel know that? You know, what kind of scams was he pulling? Like, he was maybe doing similar things or with people doing the same thing. So that's my first thing, is I really like what that sort of insinuates about Joel, that he definitely knows what these guys are capable of. And he certainly hasn't been, caught by them in any way. So he's the one that was probably doing it versus the one being scammed. That whole section in the hotel is one of the scariest sections for me. I find that there's a real terror to the human enemies, because it's the brutality. It's the fact that they're not mindless beasts. They explain, like, at a certain point that the cordyceps infection, part of why it makes them aggressive is because how it attacks certain parts of the brain, and it puts reason to it of like, that's why the runners are so aggressive. And that really almost humanizes them in a way of like, you can just say like, it's not their fault. So then the human enemies are much more scary because they're actively doing this to you. They're actively trying to kill you or worse. And it's just that much more scary for me to encounter these enemies that are completely have their mental faculties, and they're just, I don't know, the terror of facing those guys for the first time always sits with me. And it's also just fascinating to see sort of their operation as you go through that section of how they're set up, how many of them there are. It always surprises me how many of them are in this little network. So I find that section really cool, but it's one of the scariest ones for me. There's something about the human enemies are just far more terrifying.
Yeah, that's very well put. What about Henry and Sam? I'm curious what you would think of these characters. It's funny, I'm watching Lost for Knockback recently, so Micah keeps calling them Michael and Walt, like the same characters. But I'm curious, what do you make of the representation of darkness through their relationship? Because I don't necessarily like that they talk about it, but it's, I think, necessary to talk about suicide in this world. And you see in the turning of Sam's the boy, right? And Henry's the adult, or the older teenager, I guess. You see what has been replicated time and time again, no doubt, in the last 20 years, just firsthand. The agony of loss, the definitiveness of it, which is what makes Ellie's situation so interesting. And of course, in Left Behind, we see that with Riley, and she turns too, presumably. So what do you make of Henry and Sam and what they mean? And of course, they betray Joel. So even though Joel's not necessarily a good person, I don't really like them either. And that Joel kind of ends up trusting them is a little frustrating to me, because it seems a little out of character. But I think the reason that is because he's with Ellie. They would have been dead if he was by himself or with other people. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I do just want to totally agree as well. When you mention like the game handling suicide, it's extremely thoughtful, because it comes up a few times there in Billstown. And then, as you mentioned, the couple in the bathtub, it's extremely thoughtfully handled. And it definitely adds to the heaviness of the game, especially when Joel, as you said, mentions like it's not the easy way out. And I just appreciate that, because it really adds to the storytelling. Henry and Sam, they come along, Michael and Walt. And at first I was definitely like, yeah, I want to help them out, because you see the parallels of here's an adult and a child. And as you mentioned, there's so few children in the game. And so seeing another one, you're like, we have to help them. I always get angry at the part where they leave Joel behind. It makes me incredibly it's a good moment when like Ellie stays back with Joel and she's like, okay, whatever, like it's you and me now. So I really appreciate that relationship and seeing the parallels of it. But it is just, I like that section of the game very much, and seeing how you can tell like there's strain in their own relationship. Henry's reminding Sam not to pick up toys that he finds because they need to stay. It's less about the space in your backpack. It's more about staying focused in a zone of survival. So I appreciate those little moments of, a glimpse into their relationship, and Henry's willing to do anything to keep Sam safe, including, betraying the person that agreed to help them. But it's also, Joel's definitely using them. Joel sees the situation that they're in with these hunters and knows like, this guy's been here longer than I have. If he knows a way out, we're going to use it. So I certainly see it differently now of Joel almost like being, in a manipulative space of like, I'm going to use these people to get out. And that's what happens in the end. We're the ones that end up getting out. It's Joel and Ellie.
I should amend what I said earlier too, is that I'm recalling that there's actually a conversation when they're skulking around that town outside of the sewer where you learn that Henry was 5 when everything was destroyed. So he's about 25, not in his late teens. But it's interesting to hear his remembrances of the world and to hear the kids talk about a world they can't even process. And I think that's what's so fascinating. Although I think I'd like to know more about how they know what they know. Like they reference the Wizard of Oz and do all these things. And so they're watching movies and they have some sort of access to media. And when they're going through the joke book or the joke books, Joel often says like, do you understand that? And Ellie admits that she doesn't. So she's laughing at jokes she really doesn't understand. It brings up the naivete, I'm saying it, I think, right, of the children in regards to not only their age, where they wouldn't really know much to begin with, but damn, they really have no concept. Like when she's looking at the ad for like a Hawaiian vacation and doing all this stuff, I love Riley, I think, is the one that says it in Left Behind when they're going through the Halloween store and she remarks like, people actually bought this shit. Like, well, they have.
Yes.
So there's some disconnect where they understand some stuff, but they don't. It's like, you don't understand Halloween, but you understand Wizard of Oz. So you have some sort of access to knowledge, and that's taken care of a little more in the second game too.
One other point I just want to make on that note, there's a part where Ellie sees like an advertisement and she asks why the woman was so skinny, because she said, didn't you have a lot of food in your time? And that though strikes me as a bit odd, because as you mentioned, it's like, well, if you know like Wizard of Oz and these various things, it's like, what celebrities would look like, basically. Like you must have seen a magazine before, an advertisement. So the idea of a kid thinking everyone in the old world would have been like heavy because they had access to food, and that it's cute, but it's also like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make too much sense.
Yeah, there is like they really should have leaned into one or the other. What would have been interesting, who am I to rewrite The Last of Us, but it would have been interesting if she was like if she had like real deep knowledge, or she thought she did, based on like very limited access to things she's seen and watched. So it would have been more interesting if she made assumptions about the things she saw and she was just wrong about them because she had seen this sitcom or these movies or whatever, read these books. But whatever. Yeah. I like this idea too that they deal with in the game of forbidden knowledge or lost knowledge. They do this in two different ways. The hydroelectric dam in Wyoming is one, when you meet Tommy, and how they're getting this thing back up. And it's kind of incredible. Like, they're working to get this ancient, at this point, it's not literally ancient, but this old defunct tech going. And at the university, you learn again, and later in Salt Lake City, I mean, Joel killing the doctor itself is like a crime against humanity at this point, because that guy actually had like old world knowledge, which would have been so interesting. So what do you think about that idea as they explore in the game of not having and knowing things anymore? Like the fact that they got the dam going is just incredible. And Ellie says when they go to that fake Colorado university, she talks about how alien it is to her that people would just go here to learn. And like, so again, something she might have understood or might not, depending on what she was exposed to, maybe in terms of the fiction she read or watched or whatever. So talk to me a little bit about the idea of forbidden knowledge, and if that's something that's interesting to you in this universe.
Sure. It really starts to set in like when they get to Tommy's, and he's talking about, how they're starting to, they have livestock. And he said, people said you couldn't live this way anymore. And on the surface, it's just a statement, but you do realize that very key people with important survival knowledge, medical knowledge, engineering, these people, a lot of them are dead. And yeah, getting the dam up and running, your odds of maybe finding an engineer are pretty slim. It's just the idea of there are a few people who are either smart enough to figure this out, or there are a few survivors who will hopefully try and pass on that knowledge. But it's when you're in the college and you're in the dorms. And that's what really kind of sunk in for me, of it's this generation lost. Thinking about the number of young people that were studying at the college that were probably infected and died. And you're realizing, like, what were they studying? What sciences and things were they studying that are completely lost? You can't just teach a 10-year-old medicine. They can't learn it. It's like we have to build up a new generation. We have to have enough kids now survive in the quarantine zones, finish their schooling, learn. But if all the professors and all the, instructors are dead, who's teaching them? So that's a fascinating part of it for me, to think of the knowledge lost, the idea that you could have all these books but not be able to understand them because no one's here to teach it to you. And the college is actually a really sad setting for me, because you're looking at these dorms and you're thinking of young people full of promise going out into the world, learning various things, and just cut down. And when it comes to, when you're at Tommy's, and it's very basic things. They're talking about farming, agriculture, but it's like, man, these are skills. These are things we learn over a great passing of time. And we lost so many people to this tragedy that we're learning them again. I find that really cool and a great part of the game.
Yeah, totally agreed. And I love it's hard to hear. I mean, you're playing the character, but when Joel kills the doctor, one of the nurses is like, "You're an animal,"
Yeah.
And it's true. It's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? This is maybe one of the few people left in the world that was trained in a real university and has knowledge to do this, but also to pass that knowledge on to others and all the rest. So it's something very interesting to think about how quickly that stuff can go, because it's not only about how, like, we can all read the books and stuff, but someone has to have the practical ability to conduct the experiments, or to have the high level knowledge of math to do the equations, or it's like just because it's in a book or exists in some sort of repository doesn't mean someone can do anything with it. It's just like how Egyptian was just staring everyone in the face for like 1,500 years and no one knew how to read it. And it was only when they found, the Rosetta Stone that they were able to even do anything with it. So we're like only a hair away from that, it seems like, at any given time, which is fascinating. Imagine if an EMP destroyed the internet and that, like, all electronics, and And then a bunch of people died. And so you had just no practical knowledge except for what was written in books, and hopeful that people might be able to put that knowledge together. Remember, I bring this weird stuff up to Micah sometimes where I'm like, imagine going back to like the Revolutionary War, and you could talk to everyone there and you can tell them whatever you want about the future, but it's only what you know, right? So you can be like, dude, there's like electricity that lights light bulbs and does all that. And they'd be like, how do you do it? And I'm like, I have no idea, but I'm telling you, it can be done. And would that knowledge alone have set forth a line of inquiry that would have gotten us there 50 years earlier or something? I love that kind of shit. Like what could you yourself tell them? You'd be the smartest person to ever exist in 1750, just based on all your knowledge of what would it be to come. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the ski lodge and the winter kind of period when you play as Ellie. This was, of course, a huge surprise when the game came out. There are several huge surprises in the game. The first is the intro, of course, and the second would be this, I think, where you play as Ellie, although I think everyone was expecting it. And this idea that maybe Joel's dead as well, which I remember thinking when the game started, although I figured they wouldn't do that. Naughty Dog in the Uncharted games always made it seem like they were going to kill Sully, and they never did. So I was like, we'll see. But I really enjoyed playing as Ellie. It was interesting to kind of lose your skills, lose your ability to use some items, have a smaller arsenal. And there's something really scary about a 14-year-old girl skulking around these guys that I presume would rape her. And like when they get their hands in Pittsburgh on her leg and are pulling around, it's like, well, what are they going to do to this chick? You know, now, during the ski lodge and the whole snow section, we have a different idea of what they might be doing to people there. And that's when we meet David and that whole sequence. And that sequence is so interesting. And it makes you wonder. It doesn't make you wonder, actually. Like, they were going to incorporate her. I don't think they were going to do anything to her. She like really made it impossible for them to work with her because she's so dangerous that she probably would have been some sort of asset to their clan or whatever. Talk to me about that whole sequence when you play as Ellie, and if anything sticks out to you. It's scary, and I like how they revisit it, by the way, in Left Behind and kind of show you what she was actually doing.
Yeah, I want to start with Joel's accident, because that's one of the few moments in the game that filled me with just complete dread, knowing that it was coming. Because the entire way up to that, I could feel it like in my back of like, I hate that moment. I wanted to look away, but I didn't. But it's one of the few moments that just filled me with dread, knowing it was coming.
I think walked by that section twice. You can actually see the rebar sticking out of the ground. So, yeah. Because
there's also the section, I believe it's in the hotel after he falls down the elevator, and you have to start the generator. And having played the game before, you know that once you start that generator, the bloater comes out. So that whole sequence from Joel's accident forward filled me with dread because I knew it was coming. It's immediately just, you feel so small playing as Ellie. You feel so much less powerful. And it's completely scary to be encountering these strange adults in the woods. You don't know what they want with you. But Ellie she's dangerous. Like you said, she's smart. She gets their rifle from them. The entire sequence where you're with David evading the infected while his friend, is supposed to come back with the medicine. But you just feel so much more vulnerable as Ellie. It does not feel the same at all as playing as Joel. And I really love what that does for the story. Here's this whole sequence where you are small, you're much more fragile, you're smart. Ellie is smart and cunning, but she cannot fight these people off the way Joel can. And that just the way it actually plays out for you, I really enjoy. And I find just David in general incredibly disturbing. His sequence at the end, certainly, probably get to that separately. But that playing as Ellie just opens up a whole new set of emotions of this is the person you're protecting the whole game. And suddenly you're out on a limb trying to protect someone else. And you're in the same world. It's just as scary as it was before, but now you're tiny. And you also have, being Ellie, you know that you are the potential savior of humanity, as she jokes in the game. But it's true. And then now you're not being protected by anyone. You're protecting yourself. It's really powerful.
One of the cool things that they do with Ellie, if you go into her backpack, is you can see all the things she's been carrying, which I think is neat. And one of them is a letter from her mom, Anna, which I love. Did you see this? Did you do this
I
at all?
did not.
Yeah, so there's a letter, like a handwritten letter to Ellie from her mother I think it kind of insinuates that she's dying after childbirth. I don't really know for sure. I'm sure maybe people have better answers about that. But it just goes to show, like, Ellie's carrying this around with her. And it's like how she needs to, like, listen to Marlene. And the mom says, like, I didn't want kids. I don't love kids. I don't like kids. And holding you, it's like changed my entire outlook on this. And it's just too late and whatever. I don't know, like, what's going on with that. But, and I don't know if it, like, I'm putting this together in my mind right now. Is there some insinuation, I wonder, that Anna got bit when around the time she was having Ellie? Is that what made Ellie immune?
Oh, that's very interesting.
So I don't know if that was something that they went into either there, but you had brought up David Moore, and that character is disturbing. They couldn't help but get Nolan North involved, of course. What do you think of?
Is that who that is?
I think so. Yeah, let me look for sure.
Yeah, have Jamie bring that up.
Yeah, it is. It is Nolan North. Yeah, have Jamie. I am Jamie. So talk to me about this character. Very disturbing. It seems that they are some sort of, and I've tried my hardest not to read like outside. I'm trying to like interpret it the way I've interpreted it, especially these days, but that they're cannibals, obviously, but they're also like religious nuts, which I think they get into. Well, I don't even want to say anymore. So talk to me about, David and what you think about their whole crew, and Joel and Ellie ravage those people. I mean, like, they are done based on just it's amazing stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. You notice it right away when you and David are fending off the infected, and Ellie curses, and he reminds her not to curse. And that's your first inkling that this man is, a religious man. He also, in earnest says, oh Lord, help us, things like that. And he's not saying it, offhandedly. He means it. So that's your kind of first inkling that these people are devout in some way. And so at first you feel a bit safe. You're like, this is maybe a nice dad type guy. Of course, like, you're suspicious because of the setting. But your very first impression of David is he's a devout dad person, probably a safe guy to be with. He gets more and more sinister as it goes. But as you said, he sort of, Ellie pushes him to that point. When his comrades want to eliminate Ellie, he still has an idea of keeping her, putting her into their group. For maybe that was nefarious in its own way, but he had the idea of keeping her alive. And Ellie's the one that keeps pushing him. She bites him, things like that, breaks his finger. She's the one that's antagonizing them further when they keep saying, like, we'll keep you alive. Of course, like, she wants to get back to Joel, help him. But David as a character, that twist of him just growing more and more sinister as it goes. The sequence of him and Ellie in the restaurant is the scariest moment in the game for me. I was screaming. You heard me. Like, that part was really hard for me to play through. I kept putting the controller down because my hands were so sweaty. Because it comes back to the idea that the humans are the really scary ones. You can outsmart a clicker, but you can't outsmart David nearly as easily. And he was just a monster at that sequence.
Yeah, he was. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were ending there. He was it's menacing, and there's something. It's interesting though. Like, Ellie instigates them so much that you wonder, like, what their real nature is. They have kids. They talk about that they have, like, a bunch of kids somewhere. We don't ever see them, stashed away families and all of this. So the game goes out of its way. I feel like I only really realized it in subsequent playthroughs, including in the part 1 playthrough, that it's much more gray than you think. Like, the game is telling you you're not necessarily doing the right thing over and over again. And I'm not saying being cannibals is the right thing, but it's not quite as cut and dry as societal norms today would suggest.
Right. And when you mention, like, Joel and Ellie decimate these guys, it's like, knowing that they have a community that they're caring for, we have potentially killed even more people, because the amount of them that you take out, like from the ski lodge, and then as you're going through, David's little town, the number of, like, able-bodied men that you kill And then thinking like, how many women and children are behind the scenes? Like how many people did we really kill because now we've taken away their protection and providers, as horrible as they might have been? Like, what is the real consequence of that?
Yeah, indeed. Finally, we end up in Salt Lake City. They finally have caught up with the Fireflies, or what are left of them anyway. They're St. Mary's Hospital. One of the things I like about this in the time leading up to the hospital, especially, of course, there's the giraffe scene and all of that, but is how sad Ellie is. Something inside of her knows that she might be splitting up with Joel soon, and they've become so comfortable with each other. I sometimes think if you're traveling in this analog time like they are with each other for months, you certainly get to know each other. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of silence, but I'm sure there's a lot of eventual talking and rapport and an affection built up. And I really dig that. And I dig how Joel can kind of identify that. And he's trying to cajole some more feeling out of her as they're getting to the hospital. And there's a somberness to it because you know your own adventure is wrapping up as well. So you know this game that you don't really want to end. Like you kind of want to exist in this game. I don't want to like exist in this game, but I want to exist playing a game like this for a long period of time, I should say. There's some sort of personal sadness for me too. So talk to me a little bit about Salt Lake City and what you think about, you know, the drafts and Ellie's kind of acceptance of her perceived fate, and neither of them really understanding what is at stake. I think Joel literally says it'll be like a blood test or something, but it's much more serious than that.
Right. One of the main things for me is that our attachment to Ellie forms much faster than Joel's does in the story. If you're me anyways, I really started to like Ellie very much, you know, right around Billstown. And after that, it's still when her relationship with Joel was a bit frosty. And then there's the entire sequence where Joel wants to have Tommy take her to the hospital instead. And that's a little bit of a falling out between them, but they come back together. So Joel's own relationship with Ellie develops much slower than the players. And at this moment, when we're finally en route to the hospital, it feels like it's caught up. It feels like Joel loves Ellie as much as I do. And it's the way that they speak to each other. They definitely have built more of a comfort with each other. They've shared more secrets. You know, very early in the game, Ellie tries to ask questions and Joel flat out doesn't want to talk about it. Including when, you know, Ellie wanted to talk about Henry and Sam's death, and Joel did not want to discuss it. He didn't want to talk about these sad or heavy issues with Ellie. So when we get to this point in the game, and it's very clear that Ellie is sad, Joel is actively trying to cheer her up. If you were earlier in the game, Joel would have just been thrilled that she was quiet. One of my favorite moments is when she starts whistling, and he says, "It's just another thing for you to annoy me with." So they really had some contention between them. And now we're finally at the point where Joel loves Ellie, I love Ellie, and something's wrong. It always just is a very sad moment because as you're going through these areas, there's a part where Joel needs help with the ladder and you call to Ellie and she doesn't respond. And it's a little pause in the gameplay of, hey, like, she's not just a robot. She's sad. And I hated that feeling. And it's a moment, you know, it has more intensity knowing what's coming. Ellie saying that she wants Joel to teach her how to swim, things like that. And you're feeling it more and more like, oh no, I don't want to bring her to the hospital. I don't want to do this. And Joel kind of puts that in Ellie's mind of, we don't have to do this. We can go back to Tommy's. But Ellie wants it to be worth something. She knows she likely feels guilty still. You know, even though they're survivors, she feels guilty of killing other people, which would be healthy and normal. So Ellie wants it to all be for something. And that feeling, to imagine being like that young and feeling that way of all these horrible things I've done, and they have to mean something, they have to be worth something. And all that is weighing on her as they're en route to the hospital. It's a really just incredible sequence to go through. And there's kind of like a relief when you finally, I don't know, you just really feel like Joel cares about Ellie. Finally, you know, he finally is on the same page with the player of, I like this person and I don't want anything to happen to them, because that disconnect is almost uncomfortable to play through when you're like, I don't like when he's mean to her, you know, but you're controlling him. And I just really enjoy that section, knowing that they finally have the relationship that in my head was always there.
Yeah. Let's talk about the ending. The Snack Squatch wrote into us and said, "Hey, Colin, With much time passing since your original review discussion during your IGN days, I'm curious to see if your opinion has changed at all about Joel's choice to save Ellie at the end of the game. I know you said Neil confirmed there was a 100% chance they'd find a cure. I think he says that himself on the show. But I still feel like there's too many variables. Even with them being able to create a vaccine, how would they be able to manufacture it, mass produce it, get it across the world? Do people trust and believe that they are receiving the cure? Some crazy group of hunters killing others to keep it for themselves. What do you do about the already infected? I feel even with a 100% cure, humanity in the world is far too gone to benefit from it minus a small group of people. If I was Joel, all of these factors would be major points I'd consider. A second daughter wasn't worth all those factors, and my opinion on his decision still hasn't changed since I played the original back on PlayStation 3. Thanks for all you do. So thank you for writing in. What he's referring to is I did a spoiler cast back in 2013 and when I was at IGN with Neil Druckmann, and I told him that my interpretation of the ending was that there was no guarantee that it was going to work. And this is not apparently true. He says that at least his intention as the writer was that it would have worked, that they would have gotten the cure. Now, everything else that you just said, Snacks Watch, is true. How would they proliferate it? Would it have actually gone out into the public? Would it have not been destroyed? I mean, there would have been a million things wrong. But what he was saying was that if they killed Ellie, they would have had an actionable vaccine for the infected, whatever, the cordyceps, let's say. So the ending is complicated, but knowing that that was the intention is kind of disappointing because to me, it was the nebulousness that let Joel off the hook. And so knowing that, even though Joel can possibly, I guess, know that, it makes him more evil, I guess, or bad in a way. And I think that that's what the game is. The game is about the complexity of feeling. Like, Joel is doing the wrong thing. There's no doubt. And he straight up lies to Ellie, completely lies to her at the end, which is what's so awesome about the game. I mean, and she knows, right? Like you can kind of tell in her face, like she gets, it's not all the way, all that he says it is, but it's the selfishness of a father and it's the redemption of being able to save the girl in front of you this time and full circle with Sarah's death. And I think it's that literal. So I'm wondering what your interpretation of the ending is and what you think of it, especially as we've played through it in part 1. Yeah,
the very first time I played the game on PS3, I hated the ending. I was screaming at my TV because I didn't want to do it. Like, as soon as Joel went rogue and decided he was going to rescue Ellie, I was like, felt like Spec Ops: The Line. I was like, I don't want to do this. I really didn't want to do it. I was like, no, we came all this way. We have to do this. My very first playthrough, I was of the mind of Ellie has to do this. I did not want to save her. Like, I didn't want her to die, but I did not want to do any of that. So I was angry the first time. I hated that Joel lied to her at the end. I hated just that he murdered the doctors and everything. I hated the ending the very first time. The second time I played the game, I loved Ellie so much that I was like, let's go save her. It was a completely different feeling of when I'm in that section. I was like, yes, we're going to go save her. We're going to bring her home. And then playing it now, I was back to being angry at Joel, but less so. I was still angry I had to do that. I did not want to make that decision. I was still upset that that was the choice he made. I wanted there to be the cure. I wanted the vaccine. It was the right thing to do. And part of that being Ellie's own guilt. You know, she didn't want it to be for nothing, that she murdered all these people. And I really hated that. I hated wrestling with that feeling. I'm glad that the game, is set. I'm glad that there's no choice on the player's behalf. I'm glad that you just have to do it. But this time around, I felt more sad than angry. I didn't like what Joel was doing, but more than anything, as you mentioned, there's a very literal thing of he's saving this child. This time he can actually do it. This time he can save her versus his own daughter. He couldn't. But I felt miserable the whole time playing that section. I didn't want to kill any of those guys. I especially didn't want to kill the doctors. It was a really horrible feeling to realize that Joel is just sinking further and further. He's just going completely away from the moral right of what to do.
Yeah, I think it's deeply human. It's an amazing ending. And again, with no matter what the reality of the vaccine was, according to Neil, Joel couldn't have possibly known that. So he's not working from that completely moral black and white area. Like he has more knowledge of the Fireflies over the years than we are given, and so he might have cause to believe that they're full of shit or they're lying, and also he's seen the evidence of them getting beaten back more and more, like all the way to the Salt Lake City. They didn't find them anywhere they were supposed to find them, so they're kind of losing. And I don't know. I love the complexity of the ending. I love that he kills Marlene. I mean, it's dark. It's really, really dark. If you read the note again that Ellie's mom, Anna, leaves for her, it's clear that Marlene is like her caretaker the entire time. Like, and they were best friends. It's a very deep thing to happen. But people always say, like, what would you have done in that situation or whatever? It's like, I have no idea, man. I mean, it's pretty deep. I mean, they grew to love each other, and it's profoundly human. I personally love the ending. The Fury 4815 wrote in and said, "Hey, lovebirds, I played through the entire game. While I believe this is the definitive version, and at first the amount of graphical differences made me want to keep playing, but after a few hours, I got over the graphics and realized that I'm playing the same game I played a few months ago. I appreciated the few things they carried over from Part 2 and wish they would have gone further and added all the mechanics from Part 2 and revamped entire encounters to be more like Part 2. Say what you will about the story, but you can't deny Part 2 plays better. What are your thoughts? Should they have gone further than they did with this remake?" I just wanted to speak to this really quickly because a lot of people are saying this. You can't just incidentally change the way a game plays, feels, and moves and not change everything else around that. So a lot of people were saying, for instance, why can't you go prone? And the reason you can't go prone is because the environments are not made for you to go prone. Like, everything would have to be moved around. You would probably be in really tight spaces. Nothing was designed or focus tested with that in mind. So you probably have to move geometry around. Then you're basically not remaking the game, but reimagining the game. Part 2 is a much more dynamic game, and it is incredible how it plays. But you can't go backwards and do that because you're remaking the entire notion of the game. You're not remaking the foundation of it. So I'm glad that they didn't add much more. I think it's actually quite subtle. Outside of the graphical fidelity of the game, obviously the character models are different. Everyone looks more realistic. Some people don't like the way some of the characters look, but I'm down with it. I think it looks great. And I think that the gameplay changes were subtle enough to be true to the original, and I think the original already played well. So I don't think they needed to do very much. So I'm glad. I think they played up some of the Part 2 connectivity, not only because of the title, but because they wanted to add value to the game. But I don't think that that's what it really was all about. And as far as the nature of the remake itself, I think it's when you have a game like that, 20 million sold and iconic, pretty much unanimous game of the year in 2013, you want it to be in its proper shape for posterity. And you can always go back and play the PS3 version or play the PS4 version on your PS4 or PS5. But I like that they went back and tweaked it and upgraded it so that it's like, this now can exist in perpetuity. This is on the level. And I wouldn't be surprised if they did this to more games either. And I don't know if I like that or not, and that use of resources, but it's not a bad idea to say in a world that's going to become about services, back catalog, provenance of your titles and all of the rest, you definitely want to put your best foot forward. You definitely don't want to have the 30 frames a second PS3 The Last of Us. Right? Like, it's great, but you can have this version at 4K, 60 frames, beautiful, all reworked. So I just wanted to give them a compliment on that. But there are a few other things I wanted to ask about. Brendan Bestwick wrote in and said, "Good day to the soon-to-be happily wedded couple." A little more than a year away, but thank you. "I've played a bit so far, and I'm about halfway through Pittsburgh at the time of writing in. I've been a bit surprised how the game has lacked polish. At least once I fell through the environment to my death, and I've had some clipping issues. Is it me, or is this widespread? Did you have any technical issues while you were playing the game?"
Yes. I mentioned it once. There was a moment where, as Joel, I went to use the hunting rifle, and he put his arms up, but he wasn't actually holding the gun. And I was able to fire it. It worked, but there was no gun, in the scene. I just, killed a guy with just my mind, I suppose. I did that with my mind.
With my mind?
I also had moments where I was running from enemies, and it like suddenly the environment, flashed white, for a single moment. And it did it a couple times. We would like pop in and out. And it was really disorienting because I'm, running from a clicker, and it's just like flashing on the screen. At first I was like, what is this, lightning or something? And it's just the game having issues. So there were a few moments, not many, but I definitely experienced a few moments where I thought it's a little weird to be having these issues in also like what's an offline experience. Like when you encounter problems in Call of Duty, you're like, part of that's because this is incredibly technical to have us all playing in the same map right now. But when it's an offline experience, you're like, what's going on here?
Yeah, that's true. I will say this is from a technical standpoint, the most trouble I've had with a Naughty Dog game maybe ever. I mean, I couldn't speak to the Jack and Daxter games. I don't even remember, but and certainly Uncharted and certainly The Last of Us and Last of Us Part 2, there were technical issues. I had to restart the game a couple of times, actually. There was a moment where Ellie took out her joke book and wouldn't read the jokes. So I was like, I know this isn't going to register, and so I need to restart. And then there was a time where certain sequences of optional conversations weren't appearing that I knew should have been there, so I had to restart there and things like that. And then, I was seeing stuff like you were saying, like where the screen would go white. There would be, like, depending on, I think I explained this on the regular Sacred Symbols, but if you picture the radial as 360 degrees, if you were on like 1 or 2 degrees, everything would be white. And then you would move off of that part of the radial and everything would be fine. So it was like just a certain perspective, and it would often be in like a building or something like that. And I was like, something's up with the ray tracing or the lighting here, because I don't know what that's all about. And so, there were some issues, definitely. And I hope that they get those things patched out. And that's very on Naughty Dog. So I must note that.
Did you have any issues with picking things up?
Yes.
I got to a certain point where suddenly it felt like I was playing Borderlands, like the first one. I'm moving around objects.
Oh, you have to hit the reticle like right things on the thing. Yeah.
And I'm tapping triangle and the prompt is there and it's just not working. And I'm like circling this desk trying to pick up a rag. And that was something I noticed for sure. Definitely. Like there's an issue with picking things up. And it wasn't throughout the whole game, but just different sections.
And just kind of, it's really player input problems, but not reading the intent. Like I fell into the electric water when I was going over the truck towards the end of the game. Or no, that was in Left Behind. And I was like, you know what I'm trying to do. Like, why are you making me jump into the water? I'm not trying to jump into the water. You should know that I'm trying to jump onto the box next to me. So probably some player input stuff, but not as beautiful, stunning, but not as fine at the seams as it probably should be. And hopefully they get that fixed with patches. One thing I wanted to speak on is the platinum and the cards. Thomas Bruce wrote in and said, "Hi, Micah and Colin. I was wondering if either of you would be going for the platinum in this remake. I'm currently 3/4 of the way through the game and have absolutely loved the inclusion of the activity card system for the collectibles. The trophy list is great, and I think it's potentially too easy now. I do wish there was a difficulty-related one. Hope you both loved it as much as I have. It's truly incredible. Even this being my 5th time playing it across 3 consoles, it still blows me away." I'm in general agreement with you because the original Last of Us trophy list sucks. Awful list. I remember meeting the guy. I said this before. I met the guy at Naughty Dog who'd made it. He was like a junior designer, and he was like so proud of it because he thought it was like a dickhead. I'm like, your list sucks. And we were just joking about it. I'm like, it's just a horrible list. You had to play the game online for like 40 or 50 hours to get the platinum. So it was just really a put off. But with The Last of Us Part 2, no spoilers, but you had to beat the game twice to get the platinum. And I felt like that was maybe a little too excessive, though I did it. This game, I feel like is a little easy. Again, I'm only missing 1 silver trophy and I'll have the platinum. So by the time you hear this, it'll be registered. I think Sony has telemetry that indicates that easier platinum trophies are helping their games sell better. And so every first party or second party game, with the exception of the hardcore games like Demon's Souls and Returnal, which have harder platinum lists. But when you think about like I platinum Miles Morales, I platinum Ratchet and Clank, I platinumed Horizon, even the second party stuff like Deathloop, I platinumed. Not Deathloop, Ghostwire Tokyo. So they need to kind of balance that out. However, the use of the activity cards is great. I don't know if you noticed this because you don't really play on PlayStation, but no one uses activity cards. And it's important for Sony to use this stuff if they want others to use it as well. And basically, for people that aren't aware, it kind of keeps track of what you're doing in a certain section of the game, allows you to go right back into that section to get what you're looking for. It's just this is the stuff that Sony itself needs to focus on if they want this stuff to be more widely used. So I was very pleased to see that. But the trophies have been a lot of fun. You're not going for the trophies. You don't care. So,
well, I wanted to, but there's one trophy I can't get. So I've just given up. I cannot do the fighting game thing where you're like not supposed to get hit with when Riley's sort of narrating that little fighting game. I tried. I desperately tried and I can't do it. And I said, well, that's it. I can't get the platinum because I can't do that one trophy.
I can do it for you if you want, but that's cheating. I did have Chris do I did have Chris do a Titanfall trophy for me that I couldn't get. So. But I didn't feel bad about that because I really did try for hours and hours to do it.
I tried. I kept restarting that checkpoint. And then at a certain point, I was just like, I hate this. I'm done.
Fair enough. One thing, or there's two more things, my dear, I want to talk about before we go. The first is from Jason W. He says, congratulations on your engagement. Thank you. A primary talking point around this re-release is whether enough time has passed for the remake to be worth it or appropriate. Speaking for myself, I have had a daughter since playing The Last of Us the first time. This has recontextualized a lot of the more emotional plot points for me. The death of Joel's daughter hit harder this time around, and I empathize more with Joel's initial resistance to seeing Ellie as a daughter figure in his life. I also feel like I understand his final decision in a whole new way. Has anything changed in your lives since the original release that has caused the game to affect you in a different or deeper way? I wanted to answer this. This is a great question, Jason. I wanted to answer this because the answer is yes. And it has nothing to do with interpersonal stuff. It has to do with the condition of the world. I don't want to be dramatic, but it just seems like things are teetering much more now than they were 10 years ago. Like we're like 30 seconds to midnight instead of a minute to midnight. It's not like that different, but I just feel like everything that's happened in the last 10 years, the really tumultuous previous administration, whether you agree or not, just a very chaotic time, COVID, inflation, all the economy up and down, the inability of the working class and the poor to get ahead, buy a house or have reasonable housing, like just everything that's kind of happened, it makes things seem much more tenuous. And I feel like in some way we're closer to this world than we were 10 years ago. Like, I know that sounds dark and weird, but isn't it kind of true when you think about it? I wonder what you think about that. Is that too dramatic?
A hint too dramatic, but I'll say that playing this in our post-COVID world, it was different because there was just little things. I think it's in Left Behind when Riley says, like, people are still getting infected. They're just getting better at hiding it. And I believe it's Tess says something along the lines of like, well, people keep sneaking out. That's why they keep getting sick. And it's the blame game. It's the shifting blame. It's the idea of the government trying to hide how bad things are in terms of what Riley had said. You know, they're trying to make it seem like things are getting better, but they're not. And just in living through this very strange time in history of having this, global illness and having lockdowns. And in our country, that was very different than other places. But it was a little different to play through this from the lens of we had our own kind of weird global health crisis. And it was interesting to some of the lines that they said, how they resonated with what we've been through on a much smaller scale. Nobody's turned into zombies because of this, but it was different. It definitely was different. And also just the idea of the complete, mistrust of the government in the game. Like people really resent, like, yes, these are the people giving you your rations, but they're also the people holding them from you. Like, there's a huge problem of people really hate the people in power. And that certainly feels like it's happening more and more.
Yeah. Yeah. Finally, Anthony Rented wrote in and said, I am interested in what you think about the negative reaction or thoughts people seem to have with anything Naughty Dog and The Last of Us. What has brought on such negativity regarding them? What do you think about this? Especially coming from the outside. I have my biases. First of all, I mean, I probably should have said at the top, I'm personal friends with Neil Druckmann. It's something that certainly affects my bias towards the studio in some way, I would imagine, although I think it would be subconscious. But I love the game. I loved the game before I knew them and before I got closer with them and became friendly with them. And I'm confused by it because I think a lot of it is charged by The Last of Us Part 2, which again we will not talk about or spoil here. But when you're at the top, I think there's a lot of people wanting to bring you down a notch. There's no doubt. We're both football fans. I mean, like that's what you want to do to the top team. That's what you want to do to your competitors in school. That's what you want to do to, at work. Like you want to best the people around you. And I think it's unequivocal that they are the greatest studio in the industry. Like it's not even close, in my opinion, based on the games I like, what I like to play. Now, can a lot of teams be this good if they were given infinite time and money, which they are? Yes. But they deliver. And I think that The Last of Us Part 2, the leaks certainly hurt it. And I mean, we just talked about how it hurt it with you. And the leaks were not even really accurate, which is what makes me really annoyed about them. Because they're totally mischaracterized. Like people are, I remember saying it before the game came out. I'm like, you guys are probably wrong about what you're saying. And you are. Just like you were wrong. And the reason I thought that was because people might remember there were spoilers in quotes about the original Last of Us, which were also totally wrong. I remember the spoilers in the beginning were like, Ellie dies. I remember that being the big spoiler, like Ellie dies at the end. I don't think so. So I just feel like there's something about being at the top, regardless of the subject matter, the progressive subject matter, and all the rest that kind of draw people in, gay relationships, whatever the case might be. I feel like that's kind of overblown. I feel like people just like to take the piss out of the sad dad simulator. But 9 years later, the sad dad simulator is better than almost everything that has come out. And so that's where I'll leave it. What do you have to say about the negativity around Naughty Dog?
Yeah, so I'll say for sure that the more beloved something becomes, the more the other side will actively hate it, is how it feels. Same with sports, entertainment. The more that something has a really, hyped up fan base, like that genuinely like the product, it always seems like that vocal minority comes out of the people that really hate it, and they're just more and more aggro about telling you how much they hate it. It's what we see with Star Wars and various things of like, yeah, there are people, and that to be fair has a lot of criticisms. I'm not saying it doesn't, but there are people who are genuinely happy with those new movies and love them. And then it just gets so much hate every time it's mentioned. Even if you mention old Star Wars, people bring up the new movies because they hate them so much. So with Naughty Dog, it definitely feels like they make quality products. They make beloved games. They get a ton of hatred for that. I started to see some of it with Left Behind. I do remember people being upset about the storyline, about having any sort of love interest between Ellie and Riley. I remember that being contentious, that people didn't like it. I thought it was fine. I liked the little DLC. I didn't have any problem with it and the story they told. It wasn't over the top in any way, but I do remember that starting to kind of get some people to be like, when they saw The Last of Us, that's the first thing they thought of, and they didn't like it. Certainly part 2 fueled more of that. And in terms of the leaks that were false, that was a huge part of it. And for me, that's not why I didn't want to play it. I just didn't want to play it because I was disappointed that some of it had been spoiled. The ones that were true, I was just disappointed to have known some of the story. But it certainly feels like just the more and more that something is appreciated and held up on a pedestal, the more people at the bottom are just going to be really fighting against it. Instead of just ignoring it, instead of just not playing the game, they just have to actively rally against it for some reason.
Indeed. Well, that's it. I mean, that's all I have for The Last of Us Part 1 from the audience, from my little sheet. Do you have anything you want to add before we wrap it up?
I do just want to say, if you're hesitant on playing it again, just go for it. I mean, maybe wait for a sale if you really don't want to spend the money on it, but it's certainly worth playing this version of it. As like someone who's experienced the story a few times, it's worth seeing it again. So I would definitely say play it. If you're on the fence, like I'd lean towards playing it.
I agree. I think it's worth $70. I think it's an insane quibbling over change that, yeah, it means a lot to all of us, but this is one of the highest quality games that's ever come to PlayStation 5. I mean, I know it's a retread for a lot of people, but it's a retread for me too. I played it before any of you, and I still wanted to play it again. Jeez Louise, stop being so hard out there. Let's enjoy some of these games. Things are slow right now, but we got to embrace what's out there. But yeah, if you want to save your money, 50 or 40 or 50 bucks you want to spend, I'm sure it'll go down in price. I imagine this isn't Nintendo. I imagine by Black Friday, you'll be able to get The Last of Us Part 1 for cheaper, and whether digital or physical, but I think it's very much worth $70. And I have no problem paying that for a high quality product like this. So I'm very glad to have spent 2 hours with you, my dearest one, talking about The Last of Us Part 1. We appreciate all of you out there for your kindness, your love, your support of all things Last Stand. And, Defining Duke, Sacred Symbols, Knockback, all the rest. That's it. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.